Get started. I just started a recording. So this session, you will be able to come back to it and watch it again. I'll make sure the recording is sent out to you. But welcome to Unfinished Learning Community of Practice. Very quickly, my name is Okera Hawkins. I'm a native Washingtonian. I work in DC public schools as a math instructional coach. I also work as an educational consultant, and I consider myself a change agent. One thing about myself, I love to cook. And this picture you see is of my family. That's my wife, Evie, in this picture, and my daughter, Nasiah. My wife was about 8 months pregnant in this picture. About 2 weeks ago, yesterday, we brought in a baby girl into the world. She's actually at her second doctor's appointment. Her name is Adiel Ray. So we are excited and happy to be here. A little tired, but overjoyed nevertheless. Thank you for the congratulations. And so my wife told me I could not miss out on this, this session. She knows the importance of the work that I do as well. So we had a very strong schedule set up so I can get enough sleep so I can make sure I can run this session effectively. So that's a little bit about me. And so a lot of what we're going to do today is structured around the Nebraska Teacher and Principal Performance Standard, very closely linked. I think most of you all know that this framework is designed to identify what's effective to be a teacher and a principal in your district. And so over the next 4 sessions that we'll meet together, we'll be in this community of practice. Our focus will be basically around how do we address unfinished learning in an equitable way. All right. And so we know that this work that we're discussing about equitable instructional and unfinished learning is focused on the teachers. And so we'll look at these main 3 buckets. First, planning and preparation. So making sure teachers are well prepared to be able to identify what's the focus priority for the grade level content that they're teaching. And then the next bucket, making sure they have strong instructional strategies to support on grade level learning. And then last but not least, we are assessing what students are learning, and we're making instructional decisions to adjust based on those things. Okay. And what we also know is that principals create this vision and the space and framework for excellent teaching and learning to take place. So in looking at the performance standards for principals, the first thing we're thinking about is what do principals do to create that vision for learning? Second, how do principals create the environment for continuous improvement and continuous learning for not only themselves, but also the staff that they lead? And last but not least, how do we engage in continual staff support and professional development to help teachers and staff members grow their practice? And as those people and individuals grow, we know that students will grow as a result. Okay. A couple of quick logistics. If you have any questions or concerns, definitely just leverage the chat. If you have some questions or issues with technology, you can send me a direct message via the chat. We will be using the chat feature a lot during our time together, so make sure you chat everyone when I prompt you to. If you have any issues viewing the screen, you can go to view options to exit the full screen, because in a moment I will be asking you to access a couple of documents via the web. So if you need to exit your full screen, that's how you do it. And as I stated earlier, this session will be recorded and the PowerPoint deck will be available to you shortly after the session is over. All right, a couple of quick logistics about Zoom norms. So first and foremost, be present. Do your best to keep your camera on as much as possible. Know if, of course, if there's something in your background or in your environment that's a little distracting and you think could be distracting others, definitely, you take that moment to cut your camera off, but do your best to be present as much as possible. For audio, just stay on mute if you're not speaking. That way we eliminate some of the background noise, especially if you're in a building and there's a lot going on. Also, engage with others. Even though we have a short session today, we do have one breakout room. So during the breakout rooms, definitely that's an opportunity to discuss and engage with the other people in your breakout room. So please make sure you do that. As stated earlier, definitely leverage the chat feature. And then last but not least, I will be dropping a link in the chat momentarily to some of the resources that we'll be able to access for today, specifically our note catcher. So I'll send that out to you via the chat. And if you guys need anything, remember, always just drop it in the chat and I'll be doing my best to navigate those as we move on. All right, so we're going to jump into our first scenario. And so you see several images on the screen, and here's what we're going to do. So which image best expresses your experience with addressing unfinished learning? Take a moment, think about which of these 6 images best describes your experience. And then after a minute, I would like for you to drop in the chat what letter you selected and a quick blurb as to why. So we can just start to learn about some of our experiences with addressing unfinished learning. So take a quick minute, and then I'll let you know when I want you to start dropping information into the chat. All right, if you have your response crafted and your explanation, go ahead and hit the enter button and go ahead and submit your responses. Make sure you give an explanation as to why you selected the specific image. And if you've already dropped yours in the chat, go ahead and read some of your responses, the responses of some of your colleagues. Let's take about 30 more seconds. So as you're looking at some of the responses of your colleagues, we definitely see a variety of experiences. I could see how each one of these pictures at some point represents how you feel about supporting teachers and students with unfinished learning. So definitely thank you for that. And so before we move on, we're definitely going to take a moment to go over a common definition of unfinished learning. So that way, moving forward, we're all on the same page as what we mean when we say unfinished learning. Okay. And so unfinished learning is very specific as it relates to math. Unlike in ELA or in reading, once students have a strong foundation with like reading comprehension, everything kind of grows from that moment. But in mathematics, we know that learning and development of mathematical reasoning constantly grows and expands. So for example, students have an opportunity to learn about additive thinking. So thinking about like, how do you decompose numbers in an additive sense and breaking numbers down. And then we jump from addition into multiplication, multiplicative reasoning. So how do they take that same idea, but then ratchet it up a notch to get the multiplicative reasoning? And so that's like that framework and space of when students are in like elementary school. And then when they jump into middle school, we take it up another level and get to that idea of proportional reasoning. And then that moves us into algebraic thinking, which with functional reasoning. And so the other challenge with mathematics is that we have a lot of different subjects. So we talk about geometry, we talk about probability, we talk about statistics. And so all of those things and all those concepts are interconnected. And one of the key things that we have to do as educators is make sure students see the connection between those things so that they have the ability to grow and develop and make that, have those aha moments like, oh, this is very similar to this. And so oftentimes we teach mathematics in isolation. Therefore, students don't have the understanding that these topics or ideas are interconnected, which we know they are. And so here's our definition of unfinished learning: and opportunities to solidify student thinking of a topic, skill, or idea around foundational standards or an emerging understanding. So now that we have our definition of unfinished learning, here's a quick overview of our learning in our 4-part series. So today we're going to dive deep into defining our approach to unfinished learning and teaching in math. And then our subsequent sessions, you see the focus area for each one of those. All right, here are our objectives for today. So I'll give you a moment to read those. All right, and here is a breakdown of our time today. And so we're going to jump into the second part, which is the why. And so I am going to drop in the chat the link to the note catcher, and I'll give you a moment to access that. And once you, here's the link in the chat. Once you open this link, it's going to automatically ask you to make a copy. So I would definitely take a moment to download this copy. That way you can type in it and write on it as you need to. Definitely make sure you save it somewhere so you can access it later. So let's take a minute to access the note catcher now. All right, we had someone just join us, so good morning. I just dropped the link in the chat to the note catcher. Please take a moment to open this link and make a copy of the note catcher. You'll need the subsequent pages as we move along through our presentation today. All right, so now we're going to jump into part 2, which is the why. And to jump into the why, we're going to take a look at the tale of two schools. So if you open the note catcher, you'll see the start on page 1. We have a quick little summary about 2 of our schools, and we'll talk about those schools now. All right, so we're looking at 2 schools, Piedmont Valley and Brightwood Academy. And it'll be a quick 4 minutes that you'll have to read, and here's what I would like for you to do. So you're going to read both scenarios, and as you read, you're going to think about and reflect around these 2 questions. So what is similar about how both schools approach unfinished learning? And then what are some of the differences? And then you're going to think about what might the potential impact of each school's approach be on the student's mathematical experience. Once we have a moment to read that, then we're going to leverage the chat and kind of learn more about some of the things that you guys were able to read and take away from these 2 scenarios. So I'm going to go ahead and put 4 minutes on the clock, and you're going to have 4 minutes to read both scenarios and think about responses to these questions. You have about 1 more minute. All right. As you finish up reading about our two schools, Piedmont Valley and Brightwood Academy, go ahead and drop in the chat some of the similarities that you noticed about both schools' approaches to unfinished learning. So our first response is definitely both schools acted quickly, knowing there would be issues ahead. Definitely a great point. So we're dropping in the chat some similarities we noticed about both schools' approaches to unfinished learning. All right, I see some more responses coming in. Definitely, both schools work quickly to remedy the situation, recognizing it would be hard work. They both identified unfinished learning, but approached it differently. I like the idea they formed collaborative groups to brainstorm ways to address the unfinished learning. They leveraged leadership teams and engaged in conversations. Both schools started with formative assessments. All right. So we got some good responses about some of the similarities about how both schools approached unfinished learning for this upcoming school year. Now take a minute and respond about what was different about the two schools' approaches. All right. So we have our first response about what was different. One school changed the pacing to address unfinished learning. Uh, Other response, Brightwood's principal came with a game plan and a vision for what needed to happen. Uh, ho- Conversely, Piedmont knew they had a problem, but the task was left done without a vision. Very important. One school grounded their approach on research and articulated vision. So we definitely see how having a strong vision and using sound research is the best approach. We have another one. The second school used their formative assessment data to address student math deficits using pre-teaching, small group instruction, and spiral review. Key point here, focused on priority standards instead of just taking out content. All right, so definitely you all are seeing the differences, the stark differences between the two schools' approaches. And like I said, our goal and our focus for these sessions is how do we address unfinished learning in an equitable way. And so I would love for like at least one or two individuals to come off mute and just share their thinking around what might be the potential impact of each school's approach on the student's mathematical experience. Because I know you've heard from me for a while, but we want to hear from some of the experts that are with us today. So looking for at least one or two people. Hop off mute, just introduce yourself very quickly, and then go ahead and share.
I can share. I made the comment about noticing that Brightwood had a vision and Piedmont came in kind of like, here's the problem, I'm tasking you with it. And I feel like one consequence for the students of Piedmont is that they all might still end up in various places because the different teams as they were tasked made different decisions along the way. And then there was no real outcome for what the expectation was one thing that I worried about with Piedmont's approach.
All right. Thank you for sharing. Could I get one more person to share their thoughts?
I will. My name is Nicole Kriegler. One of the things is that talked about, Piedmont talked about, Bridgeport, they talked about integrating the subject area into the other content areas and making it so that it was more relevant for the students. And I think that would have a huge impact on them because they would see it more day to day and they would see it more relevant and it wouldn't be just in its own little island for them.
All right. Thank you for sharing. And so I think it's safe to say we think that the Brightwood Academy's approach is one that's more aligned for an equitable response to this idea of unfinished learning. And so one of the things that we know has to be the premise of any unfinished learning plan are these two bullet points that I have highlighted here. So we must have high expectations for all of our students, and we must give students consistent access to grade level assignments. And so this data comes from the opportunity myth from the TNTP research that's been out for a few years now. Hopefully you're familiar with it. If not, please let me know and I can share some research, share some of the research with you. But the opportunity myth came out with these 4 key points. And so we're going to zoom in on the top 2 because those top 2 specifically directly correlate to this idea of equitable instruction in support of unfinished learning. And so very quickly, please take a look at your screen. I'll kind of give you a quick overview of this graph that we're looking at. So on the horizontal axis, we see the months of learning growth that students have. And on the vertical axis, we see some grouping. So we see what happens with all of our students. And then at the top, we see the group with students behind their peers. So this top group are students who start the year behind who aren't on grade level. And so here's some of the things we noticed or that came out of that opportunity myth research. And so when all students are given consistent access to grade level assignments, students grow about 1.7 months over the course of the year. When all students are given access to high expectations, students grow a little bit over 4.5 months throughout the course of the year. And then as we think about our students who start the year behind their peers, we see that there's a dramatic increase in what happens to those students in terms of their learning growth and development when we give them consistent access to grade level assignments. And so in this case, the research tells us that those students grow more than 7 months for those students who started the year behind. So that's a stark difference from what happens compared to all of our students. And then last but not least, when we have teachers who consistently provide students and maintain those high expectations, those students who started the year behind grow on an average of 8 months over the course of the year. So why do we show you this data? We show you this data primarily because we recognize that, especially in the climate we're in today, we're not going to address all the unfinished learning that our students have in one calendar year. But what this data does show is if we are consistent to working towards this idea of getting all of our students on grade level over, let's say, 2 years or maybe 3 years, we can move the needle and get students back to grade level learning. All right. And so back in 2014, NCTM published an article called Principles to Action. And they kind of gave like a blueprint and a guideline for how to provide equitable instruction for all students, regardless of the situation that those students are placed in. I'll give you a moment to read this quote. And the key point or the key takeaway from this quote must be the following: that all students must have access to grade level math instruction. And I would add another word, and I would say consistent access to grade level math instruction. And we know this is an issue of equity. And one of the reasons we're thinking about how do we support teachers is because in one case, teachers act as gatekeepers because they're the ones who are providing the instructions. So the belief system of teachers has to be such that all students have the ability to learn and grow. Because if the educator doesn't believe that students have the ability to, then they won't give them consistent access to grade level instruction. They'll give them access to instruction that may make the students feel successful, but it's not what the students need in order to grow against the standards that we know are the most important part. All right, and so this slide just lifts up some of the things that we've heard about our current situation with the pandemic and the need to adjust to online learning. And so all these things just lift up this idea that students are having all these negative connotations about the situation that they're in. And so just in the chat, I want you to take a moment, go ahead and read these statements that we have on the screen here, and just kind of share like a quick 1 or 2 word like reflection of what these statements mean to you or how they make you feel. So as you continue to read some of these statements, one of the things I'm gonna lift up is this idea that, speaking specifically for math instruction, a lot of the things that these quotes are talking about, specifically relating to COVID, have been in place long before COVID was even a thing. So there's been inequity in student learning across the board. And we know that students have learning loss from a variety of reasons. And so this this current state that we're in just makes our situation more drastic, and it definitely makes us feel like we need to push forward. There's definitely, I think, a great point, this idea of a sense of urgency. And I think there's a need for us more so than ever to be strategic about the one resource that we don't have a whole lot of, which is time. And so being strategic and thoughtful. And I think a lot of you lifted it up earlier, was that like Piedmont didn't have a vision. So if you don't have a vision or a game plan, you're going to waste a lot of time because people don't have a common focal point or a drive in a direction to go. And so we know that, thinking about Piedmont specifically, one of the things we could think about was that they viewed their students through a deficit lens. And so their idea of supporting students was just to go back and learn, give students the opportunity to learn all the old learning information. The challenge with that is, if we spend a large portion of time in any grade level teaching non-grade level learning, then we've decreased the amount of time we can give students that consistent access to grade level learning that the standards are calling for us to do, since we know that's an equity issue. Blanket reteaching of skills based on a BOY diagnostic, which once again means you don't spend a lot of time with the grade level learning. Also, if you just do a blanket review, the skills are taught in isolation, and that goes directly against one of our shifts in Common Core math, which is coherence, because coherence allows us and students to make the connection between how this math is, how what you learned in this one content area is connected to the learning in another area. And then this idea of like basic skills focused in on like a catch up. And so a lot of that is also linked to procedural skills. So that's like, a lot of drill and kill, which also does not lead us to consistent access to grade level learning. And I would say that Brightwood's approach would be more of an asset lens. So we view students where, hey, look, we know where our students are, let's meet them where they are and let's grow from that point. So that's a positive outlook on what we think our students can do. And so some of the things they did at that school was, the principal had a clear vision. He organized the team together, and key thing they did was prioritize like the new learning and connected it to prior knowledge. So that's once again that leverage of coherence, which is something that the standards are calling us to do. And they went through this idea of like just-in-time support. So thinking about giving students consistent access to grade level learning. What do students need to know to get access to that grade level learning? Let's embed that, and then let's keep moving on in terms of grade level work. One other key point that Brightwood did was their instruction focused on accelerating students' learning by targeting the deep understanding and concepts, and they use formative assessments to determine what students brought to the table and then how to support them moving forward. And the key thing I think here is also they focused on learning on time with their peers. So it wasn't like students were isolated and one group learned one skill while another group learned another skill. Everyone was learning the grade level content. They might have been just focusing on it from different perspectives. All right, and this quote comes from some of the architects of our math standards, and it talks about the power of progressions. I'll give you a moment to read the quote. Don't worry about that. That's just one of my 3 dogs barking at the neighbors. So this quote speaks to the structure of our standards. And so we know that there's unfinished learning that happens specifically in math, but what this standard specifically speaks to is that if we know that there's unfinished learning, we can best manage it by looking at and leveraging coherence to identify what students need to know from that previous grade level that gives them access to that grade level learning. So if we know students don't have that foundation, we give it to them in the moment, and then we immediately jump right into grade level learning, as opposed to just learning skills in isolation, which doesn't connect to this idea of progression. And so very quickly, just a recap, this table just shows you an idea of remediation, which was what Piedmont did, versus acceleration, which is what Brightwood focused on. So I'll give you a second to kind of review those things. And the key takeaway from when we look at the tale of two schools is the following: that an equitable approach is what we need to have. And then in that equitable approach to addressing unfinished learning in math, the focus needs to be accelerating students' learning instead of remediating. And so what do we mean by accelerate? So here's what we mean. So here's what we don't mean. We don't mean acceleration in the sense of some of the things that we know have been done in the past. So for example, taking math and saying, oh, a student is being successful in math, so we're going to create this new course where we're going to take 2 years of math and teach it within 1 year. We don't mean acceleration in that manner. We also don't mean acceleration by placing or tracking students in accelerated math courses or honors courses based on perceived ability. Here's what we mean by accelerate. We mean make the connection between the unfinished learning in the context of new learning. So leveraging coherence. Also integrate new information and the needed prior knowledge as necessary so students can get consistent access to grade level learning, and it allows them to continuously move on. And so now the question is, how do we address unfinished learning in an equitable way that accelerates learning? All right. And so we're going to work through a series of steps that allows us to answer this question effectively. And we're going to jump into the what part of our agenda for today. And we're going to focus in on 3 key actions for math acceleration. All right. So here are the 3 key actions for math acceleration. First and foremost, you must understand. So you have to have a clear idea of what the challenge is and what the content that you're teaching is, and the connections to prior knowledge that are needed in order for students to have success with grade level learning. Second step is to diagnose. So doing these advanced formative assessments that are short and timely to give teachers real-time data about what students are already bringing to the table. Because if a students have the content knowledge needed to give access to grade level learning, there is no need to bring in any prior knowledge necessarily in order for students to get access. And last, once you've been able to understand and diagnose, you create a strong, cohesive plan, and then you take action. All right, so then we're going to jump into the first step, which is understand. And the way we're going to learn more about this first step is we're going to look through a case study. So let's meet Miss Franklin. Miss Franklin is an Algebra 1 teacher, and she's the Brightwood Academy math content lead. And so Miss Franklin is part of that team that the principal at Brightwood put together to kind of lead the charge for supporting the teachers with addressing unfinished learning. One quick thing that the principal did was he provided Miss Franklin with some release time so that she could actually effectively plan and implement a professional learning community so that teachers have consistent access to this idea of working together to kind of game plan around how to best support students with unfinished learning. So if you take a look at your note catcher, and you're going to look on pages 4 and 5, Miss Franklin, they go through a quick idea how Miss Franklin's approach to supporting the teachers with their upcoming unit for Algebra 1, which is focused on functions. So I will give you 4 minutes to go ahead and read the quick case study standards analysis on page 4 and 5. Then when we're done, we're going to respond to this question in the chat. How does Ms. Franklin's approach to standard study support teachers with identifying unfinished learning? And we're going to leverage the chat in this situation. So we're going to start with 4 minutes. This is on pages 4 and 5 in your note catcher. Let's take about 1 more minute to finish up before we start responding to that question. All right. So as you finish reading up, if you're done, go ahead and respond to this following question. How does Ms. Franklin's approach to standard study support teachers with identifying unfinished learning? So first response is like from Ms. Franklin leading the charge. She definitely did the legwork for identifying the priority standards. She focused on leading the team through a process for identifying specific concepts and strategies embedded within the foundational standards that would have a positive impact on student success at the grade level. Very good response. Looking for a few more responses before we move on. Definitely a good point. By identifying specific concepts, procedures, and strategies needed for the targeted standard, teachers can create better formative assessments to figure out where students are. Definitely a good point. All right, looking for one or two more, about 30 more seconds before we move on. So what we know about Ms. Franklin's approach was that she identified the focus and priority. And so this quote comes from the Council of Great City Schools. And in this report, they gave out 6 recommended principles and strategies for focusing on and addressing unfinished learning. And one of the top 6 strategies was prioritizing content and learning. So I will give you a moment to read this quote. So going back to that statement I made earlier about time being one thing we have like very limited amounts of. So knowing where to focus our time and energy for that essential content and learning, and then knowing which areas we don't necessarily need to teach in the moment as a result of what we know as our priorities. And so how do we know what major work to prioritize? And so very quickly, just if you guys can give me an emoji reaction to how many of you all are familiar with this document that you see on your screen here. The Nebraska Department of Education Essential Instructional Content for 2020-2021. And you should see like a little emoji icon and you can click on that to. So like you should be able to see that. Hopefully I put a thumbs up just now if you could see it. Or you can give me a visual thumbs up like this. All right, I see some thumbs up. Oh, I see them now. There we go. Got them. They were a little delayed, but I see them. Okay, cool. So it's great that you all are familiar with this. This document in our case study, the Brightwood team spent time like leaning into the Algebra 1 curriculum, and that standard that we looked at was a priority standard across the board for 5 out of the 6 major courses that were available in the study in the state of Nebraska. I will definitely give me a moment. I will put that in the chat. All right. And so the other thing is that we also had some recommendations, and this document was created from like some of the recommendations from the NCTM for how do we specifically address learning during this upcoming school year in the situation of the pandemic. And so this is a great resource. And so with that, in our case study, this is a document they use to prioritize. Thank you, Shirley, for dropping that link in the chat for me. Definitely a teamwork. I appreciate it. But this is a document that the Brightwood team used to actually identify one of those focus area standards, and then leverage the coherence map to identify the foundational prerequisite standards that are aligned to that grade level content. And so the key point and the key takeaway from this is we know that time is key and we don't have a lot of it as a result of where we are in our current situation. And so what we need to do is focus on the essential content for all students. So what are those major learning buckets that all students must take away from that current grade level to be able to successfully move on to those future grade levels? And if we're thinking back about the Piedmont example, if we spend a large bucket of time just teaching skills in isolation, we won't get to those priority focus standards and that focus learning for that current grade level, which further creates an opportunity gap for the students who we know are already starting the year behind, which is primarily students of color. Okay, so if we think about those, back to our idea of these 3 actions for acceleration. So we just looked at step 1, which was understanding where we are. And then step 2 is diagnosing the problem, which means we want to embed an assessment prior to introducing the grade level learning to determine exactly what our students know and what they're bringing to the table, so we can design learning experiences that will support their growth and development based on where they are. And so to do that, we're going to analyze another portion of our case study dealing with Ms. Franklin and her PLC. And so if you look back to your note catcher on pages 6, 7, and 8, I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to analyze the evidence analysis case study. Then from there, we're going to jump after that. We're going to have, after those 5 minutes, we'll have our only breakout room session for today. And we're going to focus on this question here. It says, what stands out to you about how the team elicited and interpreted evidence of student understanding to diagnose unfinished instruction? So while you're reading, one thing you can do is take notes and jot down some ideas that you would like to share out within your small group when you all jump into your breakout rooms. And just for clarity, your breakout room should have about 2 or 3 people in it. That way you can have a robust conversation while you guys are collaborating about what you learn. So I'm going to go ahead and put 5 minutes on the clock, and then I'll transition us into breakout rooms after that moment. You have about 90 more seconds before we'll transition into breakout rooms. All right, so as we transition into breakout rooms, we're going to respond around this question. So what stands out to you about how the team elicited and interpreted evidence of student understanding to diagnose unfinished instruction? When you get to your breakout rooms, the individual with the largest number of pets will go first. And so there are 3 breakout rooms with 3 individuals and 1 breakout room with 4. So I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms now. All right, so welcome back from the breakout rooms. I had a chance to hop into every room and hear some great discussion. So the first thing I definitely want to lift up is this idea that the teachers at Brightwood Academy focused in on the students' approach to learning. So they looked deeply at the assessment items and took away what students actually knew before just saying, oh, our students got it wrong. They don't know. We have to start from like scratch. So going deep into that analysis of the item to see what students actually knew. So then using that to plan around how to support how to plan instruction to support student understanding to accelerate their learning. Also, there were some conversations around people have common formative assessments, but aren't really looking at the data in a strategic way to make these types of informed decisions. So that was like an aha moment. And then I heard someone lift up the instructional effect of like unfinished learning, but also like the playing field is leveled. So it's something that we all have to deal with. And now let's think strategically about how we deal with it. And so on the screen, you have like a couple of like different responses or different steps to the building blocks of selecting formative assessments. So first and foremost, once we looked at the grade level standard, Ms. Franklin's team or Ms. Franklin looked at and the coherence of the standards and identified the most critical prerequisite standards that students need to have knowledge around in order for them to be successful with the grade level learning. And then from that, she designed a short assessment that allows students to use the structures and strategies that are embedded in those prerequisite standards that are directly applicable to the grade level learning. And if there were open-ended questions, so it wasn't like multiple choice or like true or false, the tasks were designed so that it forced students to share their thinking. So you could actually gain insight into where the direction students were going with answering that question, and it tells you what they know. Okay. And then it gives a light bulb to the teacher, say, hey, now I know my students have this concept. Now, instead of reteaching that concept they know, I can just build on what they already know and move forward from that point. I'm thinking about the assessment itself. So the first thing was the timely administration. So in our case study, Ms. Franklin's teachers gave this assessment 2 weeks prior to starting the unit. Why'd they do that? They did that because it gives them the opportunity to actually analyze the data in depth. And then from analyzing the data, they could actually create a customizable plan based on that data, so that they could actually move students through that grade level learning instead of just, oh, I gave this diagnostic on Tuesday, I'm starting a new unit on Wednesday. I didn't get a chance to analyze it very deeply, so let's just start from baseline knowledge or baseline understanding of that concept. So giving them the time and the space to do that deep analysis and reflect on where students are allowed them to create a plan that would move through the grade level learning based on what students already knew. And so now we've looked at our first two essential actions for acceleration. We knew we had to identify what we need to know, which is understanding. Then we did a little part of diagnosing. Now the third and final step is planning and taking action. So we're going to jump into and revisit Mrs. Franklin's case study one more time. And so when we review this instructional case study, these are on pages 9 through 11. I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes to read through this. and then we're going to come back together and leverage the chat and focus around this question. So what stands out to you about how the teachers use the formative assessment evidence to create and implement an instructional response plan? So let's take 5 minutes. These are on pages 9 through 11 in your note catcher, and then we'll leverage the chat to respond to this reflection question. Let's take about 1 more minute to finish up. And if you already finished, go ahead and you can begin typing your response. Don't send it out yet, but go ahead and start typing your response to this reflection question. All right. You can go ahead and share out your reflection in the chat to this question. So what stands out to you about how the teachers use the formative assessment evidence to create and implement an instructional response plan? So the first response in the chat is about leveraging and actually using the flex days appropriately and embedding it into the pacing guide. Uh, Placing the unfinished learning strategically in the lessons and not just doing them like at the beginning or teaching lower level content instead of grade level content. Definitely great point. So the next response is identifying the best place to address unfinished teaching and learning in the context of the grade level, leveraging formative assessments to determine how and where they will integrate previous standards. Definitely a good point. Use the data to group students to come up with a plan to support and develop student skills. And notice, I would add to that point, develop all student skills around the grade level learning, not just around like procedural skills or knowledge. The learning that was happening was around grade level learning, and it was for all students. Let's take about 30 more seconds. Any final thoughts that need to be added? One thing I would add to this idea as well is that also we know that there may be a few students who need more detail, more intensive support. And so analyzing that data gives you a clear indication of what type of support students need. So if you have like a small group session, you could actually target the support based on where students are rather than having the small groups be based on like a perceived ability or learning or an assessment that doesn't really connect to the learning that's taking place. All right. So at the top of page 12 in your note catcher, we'll just do a quick pause point and just do a quick self-reflection. So to what extent are these three essential practices happening effectively at your schools or within your spheres of influence? And how do you know? And what feels most urgent to address right now for you in your role and in your context, and why? So let's take 2 minutes to respond to these questions before we wrap up for our session for today. You have about 60 more seconds to finish up your thoughts. in your self-reflection. All right, take a few more seconds and finish up your final thoughts. I'm just going to move us along because we're quickly coming to the end of our time together. And so the next piece of our agenda is talking about the conditions for success. I'm going to move through this section pretty quickly, but also know that you'll have access to the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to kind of review these a little in depth. And so there are three main conditions which are for success, which are structures and systems that needed to be in place in order for Ms. Franklin and the team to actually do this work effectively to support and address unfinished learning for the students. And so the three key conditions for success are strategic use of time, strategically leveraging resources and people, and also strategic grouping. And so thinking about strategic use of time, these are some of the recommendations. So having math blocks that are at least 75 to 90 minutes long, if possible, within your school schedule or the day, have an additional intervention block that supports students with those foundational skills that are connected to the grade level learning. So this is something that is additional and add on to the grade level class itself. And so within each module or unit always have at least 2 to 3 flex days, which gives you that opportunity to embed those foundational prerequisite skills that are needed for students to have success with grade level content, and making sure teachers have sufficient and protected planning time and supported weekly professional learning community time. So the recommendation is for at least 60 minutes a day for teachers to have protected planning time, and at least once a week where there's probably at least an hour to an hour and a half of professional learning community time where teachers can collaboratively work together. One of the things that I do in my school is I break that time up. So I have 90 minutes per week, but I have 45 minutes 3 different times in the morning, specifically with content level learning. And then when we meet as a PLC, I dedicate additional 45 minutes of time during our PLC meetings to collaborative planning as well. So over the week, every single team that I support has 90 minutes of collaborative planning time in addition to their daily planning time. Strategically leveraging resources and people. So of course, thinking about using a high quality curriculum, leveraging what the standards have given us, which is leveraging coherence in this case, to identify those most applicable prerequisite skills. One thing to flag for you is sometimes, depending on what the content area is, you may identify 6 to 7 prerequisite standards that are aligned to that grade level standard. The next step for the leader is to make sure they identify what's the most applicable prerequisite skill based on the upcoming learning that's going to happen. So in the case of having 6 or 7, there may only be 2 that may support students in the next 3 to 5 lessons. And then there may be another 2 that will support students later down the line in that same modular unit. So prioritize the ones that are most relevant and then come back again and diagnose if you have that time to do so. Also, if you notice in our example, we leverage the special education teacher to provide that support with the general education team. And we had a leader, Ms. Franklin, who was given that release time to support the teachers. And then also, teachers support each other, which is how we grow and learn together. The last piece is like strategic grouping. So that's where we took the time to actually create that formative assessment based on those prerequisites. It was very short, which gave teachers the opportunity to grade the assessment and do the deep dive analysis of the student responses. And then we strategically create groupings that are flexible based on students' needs. So these groupings aren't fixed. So once students take one assessment, they're always in X group. The groups are based on what we're learning and what the data at that time suggests that students need in order to be successful with grade level content. So those groups adjust and move based on the needs of the students. Okay. And so as way of wrapping up, because like I said, this was going to be a quick, short session, but hopefully you've enjoyed the time that we've had together. What's next? So before our next session, and I just dropped the link into the chat, we would like for you to complete a self-assessment. And this is more for you as an individual to kind of think through where you are in your role and within your sphere of influence in your school, and what are some of the things that are already happening, and what are some of the structures and systems you can put in place so that some of this work that we described today can actually take place. Because everybody could be in a different, everybody's going to be in a different situation. So knowing where you are, and this is only for you, not for something that you need to share directly with me. So knowing where you are so you can actually move forward from that point where you are in your trajectory at your schools. Okay. And then from there, from the self-assessment, you'll have like a plan. And then this is also something for yourself. So make sure you share this plan with someone else in your building and use that person as an accountability partner. So that person will hold you accountable for completing the assessment and then kind of moving towards those next steps. And then that last piece, how you work together as a team. So your PLC team or your academic leadership team to complete and norm around this self-assessment. So definitely embed other stakeholders that are connected to this work with you so that you all as a collective can actually move forward with a plan together. Looking ahead, next month in our next session, we're going to focus in on assessing and diagnosing unfinished learning in mathematics. And that's the end of our session and our time today. I just dropped the link in the chat for our end of session survey. Feedback is very important, so definitely share any positives or any things that you would like to see adjusted so that we can actually make these sessions tailored to the needs of the group, so that if you need something specific that wasn't provided today, definitely let us know so we can make those adjustments on our end. Thank you for all the kind words. Definitely, baby girl just came back shortly thereafter. So before I run this next session in about 20 minutes, I'm gonna go upstairs and get a couple hugs and kisses. But thank you all for your time today. Please take a moment to definitely complete the survey. The link for the survey is also at the end of the note catcher, but I wanted to put it here. I'm shooting for 100% completion on the survey. So please, everybody, take like the next 2-3 minutes to complete the survey. From this point, I'm going to stop the recording, and then